All right, I think we've got most of the people let in from the waiting room now. And it's a minute or so after 2 o'clock. So I think we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone. My name is Alicia Heislip. I'm the Senior Director of Public Policy at the National Association for Career and Technical Education. And we're very happy that you took time to join us this afternoon for our webinar to review our most recent paper about the impact of COVID-19 on CTE. This one focused on leveraging federal relief funds at the local level. If you haven't already introduced yourself in the chat, we'd love for you to do so. You can also post any comments in the chat or questions. You can also use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen for questions as well as we go through. So feel free to jump in anytime. We want to make sure we get all of your questions answered as we go. To kick us off though, we just wanted to share a little bit about the resources that we have for you and the content of our new paper. Before I got into that, I wanted to highlight the prior paper from March 2021, in case you haven't seen it, High Quality CTE During COVID-19 Challenges and Innovations. This research-based paper goes in depth into the challenges and the solutions and innovative activities that CTE programs have engaged in over the past 14, 15 months or so as they have dealt with the COVID-19 pandemic. We wanted to follow that paper with something much more specific on federal funding because we were hearing a couple of different things from CTE educators. First, we were hearing that CTE educators didn't always know how to access federal relief funds that were coming from the federal government. And then the second thing we are hearing is that these funds weren't necessarily making it to CTE programs. For example, we heard from a number of people on the ground that they were using their federal Perkins dollars to pay for COVID-specific expenses over the past year, but had not been able to use these COVID-19 relief funds. So our goal with this new paper was really to provide educators on the ground with the tools and resources that you can use to help tap into these funding sources, both from an advocacy side, but then also digging into how you might use these dollars to really leverage systems change moving forward. The investment that the federal government has put into COVID-19 relief for education is really unprecedented. Over $280 billion. When you combine the K-12 and post-secondary funding streams that have been provided. And so we really want to make the best use of those resources going forward and ensure that they have an impact on programs and students for years to come. So today we're just going to run through about 4 different topics in the next 40 minutes or so. First of all, describing the federal resources. Then we're going to provide a few advocacy tips. Then we'll switch gears and talk about using the dollars, some general guidelines for planning and using funds, and some specific funding ideas. And the content we're going to review today follows the sections of the paper, so you can kind of go through and get more details on all of the topics that we cover. So to start with, I'm going to talk about the federal resources themselves. It has not been the easiest process to follow. For the past year, there have been 3 separate significant COVID relief bills passed by Congress and signed into law by the respective president at the time. First, we had the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act, known as the CARES Act. That was passed on March 27, 2020. Then we had the Coronavirus Response and Relief Supplemental Appropriations Act, known by the not very catchy acronym CRRSAA, not nearly as easy to remember as the CARES Act, was signed into law on December 27th, 2020. And then finally, the American Rescue Plan Act on March 11th, 2021. And each of these three funding streams provided different programs within them to fund education. The three main funding buckets that relate to CTE programs that are in some of these bills. First, we had the governor's Emergency Education Relief Fund. Then we had the Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Relief Fund and the Higher Education Emergency Relief Fund. So the first pot of money under the control of governors, the second pot of money targeted to K-12 education, and then the third pot of money targeted towards higher education. And I'm just going to run through quickly these buckets of funding, what we know about them, how they're allocated, and how they can be used. But I will say there are significant nuances in these funding streams. At the federal level, particularly around the higher education funding stream, and then for the K-12 level, particularly as states have received these dollars. So make sure you're digging in and reading the guidance and things that are linked in the paper to have the full picture of how these funds can be used. But I'll start with the CARES Act. The Governor's Education Fund was really designed to allow the governors of each state to have some flexibility and to identify the education providers in their states that had the most need related to the coronavirus. It could be, and most need wasn't defined in any particular way. It could be low-income communities that were hit really hard. It could be communities where maybe the primary industry in that community was hospitality and tourism, which completely shut down, in a number of places. And so they were hit hardest. Maybe it was rural areas with very limited connectivity and many students not having internet access or devices. Or maybe it was schools that weren't even eligible through the other two funding streams, such as some area CTE centers that were funded out of these governor's funds. But governors had wide discretion. It was almost $3 billion. So even that piece of money that the governors got in the first CARES Act bill, significantly more than we get for Perkins every year, which is only $1.3 billion. So it's almost 3 times as much for the governor's fund in the first round. In most places, the governors have already allocated these resources from the CARES Act. It's been over a year. They do have a little bit longer if they haven't spent them all yet, but the vast majority of those funds have gone out, and you can visit your governor's website or webpage office to find out exactly how those funds were spent. The bulk of the funds, however, from the CARES Act were split into 2 funding streams that will become the foundation of every prior piece of legislation. So the first one, as I mentioned, was the Elementary and Secondary Education Relief Fund. And those dollars go first to states and then get distributed to local school districts. It was about $13 billion. Money went out by the Title I formula. So it was heavily weighted towards low-income students. And most of the CARES Act elementary and secondary dollars have been distributed at this point. All states got their money in the spring of last year and then rolled those dollars out to local K-12 school districts, who then had a wide flexibility in how to spend the funds to address needs that emerged from the pandemic. When different organizations have done kind of informal surveying, and we've heard that the vast majority of those dollars were spent on things like personal protective equipment and other safety things, cleaning supplies. They also were spent on technology and devices to get students online for the end of the school year, broadband access, and online curriculum and professional development for educators as they ramped up to prepare to teach in these virtual or hybrid environments. The higher education funds were structured significantly differently. They were designed to bypass states and go directly to institutions of higher education, which includes all community and technical colleges that might offer a CTE programs. These higher education funds, once they got to the institution, institutions had to spend them in two ways. Half of the funds had to be used to provide emergency financial aid grants to students to help them deal with the impact of the pandemic. And then the other half of the funds could be used to address the costs that the institution faced due to the shift in instructional strategy, from in-person to remote or hybrid. Again, most of these funds have gone out. There were some studies back in the fall that by November, about 80% of the dollars had already been allocated to students that were designated for emergency financial aid, and other funds have been spent in large part in many places. Those funds did have to be spent originally within 1 year of the CARES Act funding being distributed, which in most institutions was probably, May, June, July, August, even over the summer last year. But the next piece of legislation that I'll talk about actually extended that time frame, just the way federal finance rules work. And so people have a little bit longer to spend those initial funds, as well as the next bucket of funding, which was provided in December of 2020 through this continuation supplemental funding for CARES Act. That bill in December had the very same pots of money, another $4 billion for the governor's education relief fund to be used the same way to address kind of the most pressing needs, emergency cost in the state related to education. And then the secondary and higher education funds. The secondary funds went out the same way again, first to states and then to K-12 school districts by that Title I formula. Two things I didn't mention when I was talking about this and related to the CARES Act. One of the challenges with the Title I formula for CTE is that in some states, depending on the governance model, area CTE centers might operate outside of a local school district. Maybe a number of local school districts kind of have joined together to partner and offer CTE through this area center that has its own governance body. Ohio is a great example, Oklahoma, Pennsylvania, where those centers kind of operate independently from the local school districts. And they might have memoranda of understanding to serve their students or things like that, that apply to other funding, but not necessarily this funding. And so in some places, area CTE centers did not benefit from the ESSER funds that went out to LEAs. There are two solutions to that problem. One is the governor's emergency education relief fund that I mentioned already, and a number of governors did take care of their area centers in this way. The other solution is that states are able to keep 10% of their ESSER dollars for statewide initiatives or projects or other needs outside of that formula distribution to districts. And so, for example, I was talking to someone in Pennsylvania yesterday that has this challenge of area centers operating outside of districts, and they've been working with their state, and they think, although it doesn't sound definite yet, that they'll get a significant portion of that money that the state is able to keep for other uses in order to offer services and improve programs at the area CTE center level. The other thing that I didn't mention about ESSER, and probably is one of the most important things, is that on the allowable uses of funds list, Perkins, any activities funded under Perkins is one of the allowable uses of funds of ESSER. So anything you would normally spend your Perkins dollars on fits, at least from the federal perspective, as an allowable use of funds under this education relief fund for K-12. It also includes many other allowable uses of funds, anything funded under IDEA or anything funded under the Adult Education and Family Literacy Act or under ESEA. And so there's a wide variety of allowable uses of funds there, including a number of COVID-19 pandemic related uses as well, like technology and professional development and mental health supports, and the list goes on. But it is really important, and we'll talk a little bit about this in the next section, to know that CTE activities are allowed and to make sure that your leaders know that as well. Those funds that came out in December, we have been hearing, while they've all been awarded to states, they were automatically awarded to states in January. We have been hearing that they're very slow to move down to the district level. So there is a chance, depending on what state you're in, that you may not have received these funds yet. Once you do get them, and it's obviously a substantial amount of money, you'll have until September 30th of 2023 to obligate those dollars. The CRRSAA, the Supplemental Appropriations Bill for COVID, also provided another large influx of resources on the higher education side, about over $22 billion. Those funds operated similarly to the first pot of money, although not quite as large of a percentage had to be used for student aid. The law actually says you just have to use the same amount of money for student aid. So obviously, since the number is bigger, half of 13.9, about $7 billion had to be awarded in student aid by institutions around the country. So it's really only about a third of the money in this December allocation has to be used for student aid. Another big change in this was that institutions now can use those dollars to make up for lost revenue. So if you had planned to rent out your facility or host summer camps or do customized business training that you were not able to do at the post-secondary level, or you lost tuition because you had to refund it or students didn't enroll, those are all now allowable uses of funds under the HERF program, starting with the CRRSAA money. Those funds were also awarded to higher education institutions automatically if they already had a CARES Act grant. So the money just kind of showed up in your Department of Education G5 system. There weren't additional things that schools had to do to get the money. And then finally, the bill that really prompted this paper and that we go into the most detail on is the American Rescue Plan Act, which was just passed in March. It did not include a section of funding for governors, but remember that much like the earlier bills, states can keep up to 10% of these elementary and secondary dollars to use for really any need they identify across the state. And as the pot of money has gotten bigger, that 10% of the dollars at the state level has also gotten bigger. So there is definitely room for states to kind of work and address challenges there, including CTE programs that might not have benefited from the formula. The ESSER dollars for this program have started to go out. The department released about $80 billion, about 2/3 of the money in March to states, really soon after the bill passed. However, we are hearing even more that these dollars are moving slowly, getting down to local institutions. In some cases, state legislators have to approve the dispersal or the State Board of Education. And so in some places, the districts have not seen this money yet, which while we know it's desperately needed, in some ways gives you time to do some of the planning that we'll talk about here in just a minute. Those funds have to be obligated by September 30th of 2024. So it is over 3 years away. And I think that's really important to keep in mind as you think about using these dollars. It is a one-time investment of funds, but they don't all have to be used this summer. You know, you can think long-term about how you can spread funding and meet student needs, not just today, tomorrow, but well into the future. The American Rescue Plan Act also provided another almost $40 billion for higher education. Very few details have been released by the department about how higher education institutions access those funds. So if you're listening, you're interested in how to get those, we will be following that process very closely and putting information up on our blog as soon as the department lets higher education institutions know whether they need to fill out a new application or the funds will automatically be awarded, or if there's any new assurances that have to be made. So with that, I'm going to shift for just a minute for advocating for CTE funding. As I mentioned, CTE is an allowable use of these dollars, but it's not a required use of funds. And so it is very important that CTE leaders are aware of the decisions that are being made, understand who's making decisions, and are prepared to provide input. So first step is to figure out, if you're at the K-12 level, you know, where the dollars are at this point. Has the December allocation made its way to districts already? Has the March allocation made its way to districts? Who's making the decisions about getting the money from the state to the local level? And then once the money actually reaches your school district, you know, is it your federal programs office? Is it your school board? Is it your superintendent? Who's making the call on how to spend these dollars? Similarly, at the post-secondary level, you know, is it your president's office? Is it your chief financial officer? Is it your financial aid office that's making a lot of decisions? Is it an advisory committee? You know, figuring out who's making the calls about where to invest these resources is probably the most important thing you can do. But then follow that up with seeking opportunities to provide input. In larger institutions, larger school districts, those might need to be very formal opportunities. In smaller institutions or school districts, you might need to just go talk to somebody and provide suggestions about how these funds can be spent. We encourage you to be as concrete as possible with your project ideas and include data and evidence to support your initiatives or activities. And we have some suggestions on where you can find some of that data in the paper. And then message CTE as a solution. We really think that CTE is in a prime position at both the secondary and post-secondary level to help address the needs that have emerged from the pandemic, for re-engaging secondary students and helping get adults and post-secondary students back to work. And so weaving in those messages to your requests can make them stronger moving forward. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Catherine Imperator, our research manager, who's going to talk about just a few of the funding ideas that you might find more about in the paper.
Thanks, Alicia. And I think if anybody has any questions for Alicia, maybe about those uses of funds, you can put those into the chat. And we are recording, and I believe that that will be shared. All righty, so go on to the next slide. Before we get into specific spending ideas, we wanted to give you some general ideas to consider when planning for how to use these funds. So, you know, of course, as with any funding source, it's important to have a thoughtful plan where you lay out your priorities when making purchases. Now, time might be a challenge in some cases. If you're thinking about starting up a summer program, you're going to want to be doing that right now. But it is important to remember that American Rescue Plan Act funds can be used through 2024, so you do have a longer window. Another thing to think about is balancing short and long-term needs. While addressing short-term needs, can be very critical, we do encourage you to kind of think big about how you can use American Rescue Plan funds to make systemic improvements that have short and long-term benefits, and really kind of think about a solutions rather than a Band-Aid kind of approach as we return to hopeful normalcy. So just a few general tips. Centering equity. Obviously, the pandemic has highlighted and exacerbated existing inequities. So really kind of centering that as the basis of your decision-making, including looking at data of access and performance and trying to understand the needs of underrepresented, missing or struggling learners right now. Also want to engage stakeholders. This is both required under guidance from the department. States are required to engage with a long list of stakeholders. But not only is this required, but it's effective from the standpoint of learning what your students and their families and your employer partners need right now. You can take a similar approach and follow a similar process as you did for your comprehensive local needs assessment. Those same contacts can be leveraged for these decisions. You do want to start probably by thinking about your immediate needs first. Ideally, as Alicia mentioned, earlier rounds of funding were hopefully used for things like personal protective equipment. But if your institution is still not offering in-person learning to all students, these funds can facilitate that by helping you to purchase additional materials so that students don't have to share, by expanding space, by having extra staff to allow for more socially distanced lab work. If your institution is providing in-person learning for all students, then you can also shift your focus to be looking at things like helping current students address any unfinished learning, any industry certification assessments that they missed, work-based learning experiences that they missed, and getting them through completion. Now, at the same time, again, it's kind of a balancing act, but if you can also think big about how to use these funds to go beyond plugging holes, to look at kind of bigger, bolder solutions that will have a long-term impact, that can be a really great use of these funds. For instance, last spring, you might have handed out Wi-Fi hotspots to students, and that was a great idea at the time, but it's a bit more of a Band-Aid approach. You might, your institution might think about like what are broader community solutions to broadband access that would impact all of our students and the broader community. A great option for spending these funds is to scale evidence-based strategies that have previously been pilot projects or have had limited implementation. Building on proven strategies can really help you ensure that funds are being used effectively and that projects don't get bogged down in unanticipated challenges and consequences based on things that you've learned from successful pilots and smaller activities. You can also maximize these funds by using them for multiple purposes. For example, summer programs could combine instruction and work-based learning experiences, or work-based learning experiences and opportunities to gain industry certifications. Students can kind of catch up with that unfinished learning through courses that award both academic and CTE credit. And you can also think about sharing resources across programs, across districts or institutions, such as mobile labs and equipment, or system-wide content management systems or career development systems. As with any kind of activity that you take on, looking at metrics, reporting, and feedback loops is really important to understand whether your investments are reaping benefits. And these can include Perkins indicators, other state college and career readiness measures, or post-secondary success measures that you have, as well as reporting outcomes to your stakeholders and kind of following a continuous improvement process. And last but not least, these funds are generous, but they won't last forever. So you want to look at additional funding streams that can be used to continue any activities that you begin or expand using these federal relief funds. And those possible funding streams could be Perkins, WIOA, state grants, local private funding sources. This is particularly relevant when you're thinking about recurring costs like staffing. and why it's important to think through the total cost of any purchases that you make, including maintenance and PD and other recurring costs. So that's just some general tips, and then I'll run through a few more specific funding ideas. These ideas are all fleshed out in the paper. Now, not all of them will work for your circumstance. Some might be more suitable for the secondary level, some for the post-secondary level, some might make more sense in a rural or an urban environment. So we just encourage you to kind of take these ideas and see what resonates with you. So one bucket of ideas for spending is under health and safety. And this could include things like expanding your lab space to accommodate more students now and in the future by renovating facilities, investing in mobile labs, building outdoor classrooms, different options like that. Also, extending your operating hours, purchasing additional equipment, enhancing your ventilation systems, and importantly, providing social and emotional support through hiring contractors and consultants who could provide additional services to students, as well as professional development to educators on infusing social and emotional learning more into CTE programs and uses like that. So another bucket of ideas relates to reassessing the labor market alignment of your programs. Your local economy may have had some small changes as far as occupation and skill needs, or maybe even bigger seismic changes resulting from the pandemic. So funds could be used for teacher externships to get teachers in the field talking to employers about what's changed and what's needed now, sector strategies, business education liaisons, upgrading equipment and curriculum to include more automation and remote technology, as well as possibly covering the startup costs of newer expanded programs. If there's been like a really seismic change in your local economy, you might need to expand or start new programs, and these funds could cover things like a new lab space, new equipment, curriculum, and professional development. A related bucket is about skilling and reskilling the workforce, both youth and adults. And this includes a wide variety of possible spending uses, addressing unfinished learning through summer boot camps, providing summer tuition and other incentives to kind of help learners get back in, summer jobs programs and work-based learning. These funds could cover the costs involved in revamping programs, maybe to break them up into smaller stackable credentials, or to better align non-credit and for-credit pathways to help adult learners get back into learning and reskill for new jobs and careers, as well as increased student advising. And a number of states have already used relief funds for these rapid credentialing programs that quickly reskill workers, and that's another potential use for ARP funds. Another and very important bucket of funds is under equity. And these potential uses of funds include building data systems and using predictive analytics to help you identify struggling learners, expanding broadband access and a technology and curriculum that is accessible for learners with different needs and learners with disabilities, providing all kinds of supports like tutoring, mentoring, other wraparound supports, accelerating remedial and bridge courses like integrated education and training models that contextualize basic skills education within CTE, revising curriculum, providing PD for things like universal design for learning, social and emotional learning, and trauma-informed practices. So lots of potential uses there. Another bucket is looking at innovative tools and delivery models, really building on all of the remote and blended activities that we've experimented with in the past year. This can include hiring consultants who can help you modularize courses that allow for blended learning, where you're doing some preparation remotely and then hands-on practice in the classroom. These to create professional development materials. You can also use funds to expand remote proctoring for CTE end of program assessments, as well as industry credential exams, because that technology can be difficult to scale and there are some privacy and security issues. These funds can help address that. You could create a online repository. You probably have a wealth of remote lessons, videos, and resources from the past year, creating a searchable repository of those experiences, expanding CTE programs that are all or mostly remote. There are lots of things that you can do in this general bucket. And last but not least, developing and supporting CTE professionals. You can provide professional development on many of these topics that we've already discussed in the last few minutes. You can also fund activities that will help CTE administrators develop plans to quickly respond to emergencies, natural disasters, as well as pandemics, especially leaders in institutions like area career centers. This could be a use of funds where you invest in staff training, in technology like emergency notification systems, and additional technology upgrades. Of course, addressing the social and emotional needs of educators through professional development and resources that support their mental health and work-life balance. And you can even use these funds to expand staffing. Now you want to be, again, remember that sort of funding cliff where you're not going to have these funds forever, but things like temporary staff to work one-on-one with students, funding teachers during summer programs, recruitment bonuses, helping teachers gain license and certifications, build and grow your own programs, or launching initiatives where industry professionals support your teachers but aren't on the payroll, are all sort of ways that you can expand your staffing without adding additional full-time positions. So I'll turn it back over to Alicia.
Thanks, Catherine. We put up a slide with our contact information if you end up having follow-up questions. But before we wrap up, we have Craig Statucky with us from Nevada. He is the state director of CTE in Nevada. And I know he's been doing a lot to think about how his programs in Nevada can spend ARP funding and to really leverage them for system improvement. So Craig, are you able to share for just a minute some of the things you've been doing?
Yeah, thank you. Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon. It's almost afternoon for almost everybody, I guess, at this point in time. So one of the things that we've been doing as a state, and it's every department state, not just our CTE department, is we've actually been providing a guidance document for our LEAs or our school districts and public charter schools as some guidance of proper ways. I won't say proper may not be the best word to use, but ways to spend your money that may have long-term impacts from short-term money. And we've really been trying to avoid things that I know Catherine mentioned earlier, like around staffing and things that you're going to have to spend beyond when this money expires. So we've been really looking at some things in terms of professional development and really suggesting to the school districts that they align their professional development to industry credentials and certificates, particularly around some program areas like Project Lead the Way. Right now, Project Lead the Way is still doing their professional development online. So it's a great opportunity to send all of your engineering teachers to professional development. We've really been focusing on CTSOs as a way to address learning loss. Particularly in Nevada, our CTSOs all have curriculum that's approved by our State Board of Education. So it's no longer a membership fee to a CTSO, it's a curriculum fee. And so because of the use of curriculum, it's an excellent opportunity. And we've been working with our CTSOs about potentially doing fall hands-on hybrid conferences or in-person conferences in addition to what they normally provide. And then some other things really around professional development and also collaboration between CTE teachers and core academic teachers. We're really trying to make the argument that that CTE is students who in Nevada, and I'm sure every other state, students who are in CTE graduate at a significantly higher rate than those students who are not in CTE. And so the reason is because those students are successful in math and science and English because CTE embeds all those items. And so we're trying to make sure that our districts don't think about cutting those programs in terms of we have to get students caught up by giving them an extra math class or an extra science class. CTE embeds that content in there. You just need to be creative about how you potentially get students back on track in terms of credit retrieval. So those are things that we've really kind of been looking at. And I know that we've been kind of working on this document, it seems like forever. And actually made edits during Catherine's presentation too, to add some more stuff in there. But really kind of thinking ahead in terms of, what kind of long-term impact can you have from short-term funding? And some of the things that we're looking at internally is we have some projects in the pipeline that we are working on based on current staff. It would take us a couple of years to work on. So we're looking at ways to accelerate that so that maybe we can use the short-term money so that instead of waiting for 2 years for the project to be completed, we can get it done in a year, 16 months, somewhere around there. So we've really been looking at acceleration from a State Department end on certain things. But one of the things that we've definitely been avoiding is looking at adding staff, because we know that once the money runs out, we won't be able to maintain that staff. So really just kind of getting people to think, and I know Catherine said it, thinking about solutions and not Band-Aids. The Band-Aid period, I think for us, I think for most states is over. We need to find solutions for long-term systemic improvement. And some of it is going to be data collection systems and those type of things. And so we've really just kind of been thinking of it in a larger scale in terms of what can we do now that we can still be able to maintain afterwards and still be effective. And so I think those are some things we've been thinking about. And particularly, and I know Catherine mentioned equity and those things. And one of the things that we're looking at is in Nevada, a lot of our schools are lacking high skill, high wage and demand are schools that generally probably have some equity access to CTE as a whole. And because they are in older buildings and older schools, here's your opportunity to spend a few $100,000, if not more, on manufacturing equipment or automation equipment to get them into the building and get the building up to code to be able to have those CTE programs of study. So we're really looking at it as an access opportunity as well.
That's great. Thanks, Craig. We have a question in the Q&A about, is your guidance to LEAs publicly available? Is that something we could share broadly with folks?
It's going to be, I don't know if it is yet, because what happened was every department got their own document, and now they're working on the combined single document so that our LEAs don't have to go through 10 documents to find what they're looking for. So we're in that process, and we're even still adding, like I said, I added stuff during Catherine's presentation. And I know other directors and other departments are doing the same as we kind of learn a little bit more. And we also have to gauge what our legislature is going to allow us to do with some of those things and maybe some of their priorities as well. So we're trying to make sure they're aligned. I think we're probably maybe a tad bit behind in terms of releasing funds to our local agencies. So that gives us a little bit more time, but I know that we're looking at in the next week or so, releasing another big, huge application portion for our LEAs to go through. So that guidance will be ready for them.
Great. Well, maybe once it is done, we can send it out to webinar attendees or post it.
Yeah, I'll be more than glad to send it to you, Lisa.
Okay, great. Thank you. Any other questions for us as we wrap up today? Well, thank you everyone for joining, and please feel free as you dig into the paper, if you do have questions about any of the funding streams or where to look for specific details or ideas, please feel free to reach out to us, and we will do our best to point you in the right direction. And we will continue to share resources like Nevada's as states release guides and suggestions and things so that everybody around the country can utilize those resources. So thanks everyone, and have a great afternoon.